Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to see the crowd here tonight, and I'm particularly delighted to welcome our speaker. I have known Jason Furman since the mid-1990s, when he was working as special assistant to the president under President Bill Clinton at the National Economic Council. And I was at that point a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, which is 3 people with a chair. And I have to say, if you're an economist, there's only one place in Washington you really want to be, and that's the Council of Economic Advisors. And Jason was over at the NEC, and we worked off and on with a few things together. I remember thinking to myself, this guy's really smart. I'm curious to see where he goes and what he ends up doing. Well, Jason is, of course, an economist. He has a PhD from Harvard. He's taught at NYU, Yale, and Columbia. He's worked at the World Bank. And when I caught up with him next, after we both left the Clinton administration, he was the director of the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institution in the mid-2000s, a group that has done, I think, some of the best economic policy analysis available. He went into the Obama administration and spent his first term back at the NEC, the National Economic Council, as its principal deputy director, and I had the pleasure of working closely with him on a number of issues while I was at Commerce. This past summer, he was confirmed as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And as I say, that is the best position for an economist anywhere in the administration. It's the in-house group of 3 senior economists and a very small group of analysts who provide economic analysis and advice to the president. The chair of the CEA essentially holds cabinet rank and is part of the most senior conversations inside the White House. While I've been quite happy to be gone from DC over this past fall, and away from the shutdowns and the ongoing budget debates, there is one thing that I really miss. At Commerce, as at CEA, I received daily data and information about how the US was doing. It's like someone was in my office at 8:30 every morning saying, here's what we know. Now, I admit I've been in quite a bit of data withdrawal since coming to Madison, because it's sort of not quite the same when you've got to look it up yourself on the internet. It takes an awful lot longer, and half the time I can't find what I want. But Jason, however, is very much not in data withdrawal. He was in the midst of the people who track the economy most closely. So we are very fortunate to have him here, and he's been kind enough to come to tell us what he is seeing happening in the economy. So Jason, thank you for coming to Madison, and the floor is yours. Welcome.
So thank you so much, Becky, and for having me here. Becky, I loved working with you for those 4.5 years, and if you bring anything close to what you brought as acting Secretary of Commerce to what you did for our country, for our economy, to this university, everyone here is extremely lucky. And thanks for those comments about the Council of Economic Advisors. Before I get into any substance, I will take advantage of doing a brief advertisement of it is a fantastic place to work. We hire RAs straight out of college. We hire graduate students on leave. If you have any faculty you want to send us for a year, we'll take them too, and our website will tell you how to do all of that. So my topic today is fiscal policy, accomplishments, challenges, and opportunities. And I'm going to take that topic and define it quite expansively to fit, most everything that matters in the economy under it. Now, there's some things that I can't quite squeeze into the topic, and I'll mention them and list them very briefly at the end. And if you have any questions about them, happy to discuss them when we get to that point. But fiscal policy is something that matters a lot for our short-run growth. It matters a lot for our long-run potential. And it has a really deep impact on everything from education to national defense, from poverty alleviation to healthcare. And it's also an issue that I personally have been very deeply involved in from even before the administration began and helping the president to craft the Recovery Act to all of the most recent fiscal issues that we've been facing. But before jumping in to the specifics of fiscal policy, I wanted to step back and talk more fundamentally about what our ultimate goals are, what we're trying to achieve in the economy. And I think of those goals as falling in 3 general areas. The first area is that we want to continue returning the economy to its full potential. The economy has made rapid progress in the last several years. expanding in 16 out of the last 17 quarters. The private sector has added 7.8 million jobs in 44 straight months of job growth, and the unemployment rate has been falling at about 0.7 of a point per year. This progress has come in the face of the enormous challenge of recovering from the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. One thing we learned from economics is that growing after a financial crisis is a lot more difficult than growing after your typical recession. In the early 1980s, for example, we had a typical recession. The Fed raised interest rates, people started buying fewer houses, buying fewer cars, the economy went into a deep recession. The Fed cut interest rates, people started buying more houses, buying more cars, and the economy came quickly out of the recession. When you have a financial crisis, it doesn't work like that because families are over-leveraged, houses are overbuilt, and it takes a while to work that off and get back to the position where you could have those normal drivers of growth. And Carmen Reinhart and Ken Rogoff have done research, not their famous research on debt, but another set of research related to that about growth after a financial crisis. And they found, looking at the United States historically, the Great Depression, the 19th century, that it usually takes about 10 years to get back to the per capita GDP that you had before the crisis. The United States did that in 5.5 years. And to put that in context, of the 10 other countries that had deep financial crises at the same time that we have, only 2 others, have gotten back to their per capita GDP they were at before the crisis. But grading on the curve, understandably, provides little comfort for Americans struggling to find a job, worried about their family's income, or having a hard time paying the mortgage. And that's why we're not putting a mission accomplished banner up and are working so hard to continue that progress. The unemployment rate at 7.3% is higher than it should be, and the Congressional Budget Office says that the economy last year was operating at about 6% below its potential. So our first order of business is closing that gap in terms of potential output, bringing that unemployment rate down, and getting the economy to where we'd like it to be. The second fundamental goal, though, is then expanding the economy's potential growth rate. To understand just how important this is and just what you need to do it, consider that in 2012, an American worker produced 5 times more per hour as his or her counterpart did in 1948. And now ask yourself why they did so much more. If you do a standard growth accounting exercise, you'll find that 9% of that productivity improvement was related to what is technically called in the statistics the composition of labor, which is education and training. Another 37% is due to the amount of capital that worker had at their disposal, a lot more than the worker did in 1948. 54% is due to what economists call total factor productivity. And that's how much output you get from a given amount of inputs, from a given amount of capital and labor. And in economics, that's the closest thing we have to a free lunch. Unfortunately, the growth rate of total factor productivity has been slowing over the last several decades. From 1948 to 1973, it grew at a 2.2% annual rate, fueled in part by public investments like the interstate highway system and pent-up innovations from World War II, like the jet engine and synthetic rubber. But from 1973 to 2012, total factor productivity growth increased at only a 0.8% annual rate. The difference between 2.2 and 0.8 cumulated over a number of years is really profound. If we had had that same growth rate we had in the post-war period and been able to continue it, incomes today would be 69% higher. That's $40,000 for a typical family. And we haven't been making up for the slower total factor productivity growth in other ways. While educational attainment has continued to increase, it's been increasing at a slower rate, and the growth of investment hasn't helped close the gap either. It's actually growing at a somewhat slower rate since 1973 than before it. So that's the second thing we want to do. We want to get the economy back to where it should be, and we want to expand its potential more quickly. If that's all we worried about, we'd miss something that ultimately is the real test for the economy, which is what it means for middle-class families, what it means for poverty, and what it means, across the income spectrum. And that depends a lot on economic growth, but it also depends on what happens with inequality. And for several decades now, we've seen a large increase in inequality due to a combination of technological change, globalization, trends in education, changes in norms, and institutional factors like the decline of unionization and the decline in the value of the minimum wage. The statistics in this area are often repeated, but they're still staggering. You look at someone at the 95th percentile and compare them to someone at the median, and their income has grown from 270% of the median worker to 375%. The data at the top of the income distribution is even more stark. Recently updated numbers from Manny Saez of the University of California, Berkeley, show that the top 1% of tax units received 19.3% of the total income in 2012. That's the largest share since 1928. And it's extremely concentrated within the top. Since 1979, the income share going to the top 1% of the top 1%, that's the top 0.01%, has jumped by 3.5 percentage points. That's the equivalent of transferring about $300 billion annually from the bottom 99.99% of Americans to the top 0.01% of Americans. So when you combine the double whammy of the longstanding trend of slower productivity growth and rising inequality with the recent financial crisis, you can see these challenges manifested in the fact that median family income, after declining in the previous expansion, is now basically flat, and that if you look at the poverty rate and measure it, not taking into account public policies, taxes and transfers, that's basically been flat for decades. So while we've made substantial progress in digging out of the Great Recession in the last couple of years, there's a lot more work to do. And that work is both in the short run, but even more importantly, once we get through the full aftermath of the crisis and fully recover, we're going to still have a tall order of business when it comes to these longer run trends. And that now brings me to the topic of fiscal policy and the role that fiscal policy plays in these three goals. And before getting to any of the specific policies and recommendations and ideas we have, I wanted to lay out what I see as three key facts about fiscal policy, and then add one judgment of my own to those three key facts. The first fact is that fiscal policy made a significant contribution to getting the recovery on track, helping to prevent a second Great Depression. The administration's most important fiscal policy was the Recovery Act. It represented a temporary but badly needed boost to the economy that was originally scored at nearly $800 billion, and it provided investments in infrastructure and innovation, relief for struggling states and localities, tax cuts for individuals and businesses, and expanded protections for the most vulnerable. Well, there's been a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking around the size of the Recovery Act. As someone who was there, I can tell you it was much larger than almost anyone was calling for at the time. It was much larger than almost anyone in Congress could imagine at the time. It was larger as a share of the economy than the New Deal, and it was something that ultimately passed the Senate with no votes to spare. It's also important to understand that the Recovery Act was not all we did. There were numerous other jobs bills that followed it that expanded on infrastructure, tax credits for home buyers, business investments, and most quantitatively significant, a payroll tax cut for all working households. And all of these were part of a broader response that included a financial rescue, housing, and independent actions taken by the Federal Reserve. Altogether, Alan Blinder and Mark Zandi estimated that these actions prevented the unemployment rate from rising above 16% and prevented the loss of another 8.5 million jobs. And these actions are very closely related to the fact that the United States, as I said, is one of 3 out of 11 countries that went through a financial crisis recently and has reattained its pre-crisis GDP on a per capita basis. So that's the first important fact. That fact is mostly a historical one, but it's important to understand the role that fiscal policy can play. The second fact brings us up to the present, and that's that the deficit has come down very rapidly, which is good for fiscal sustainability, but has been a headwind for macroeconomic performance. To put some numbers on that, the budget deficit in 2009 was 9.8% of GDP. This past year, it was 4.1% of GDP. So that's a decline of nearly 6% of GDP in 4 years. That is the largest, fastest decline in a budget deficit we've ever had in this country, with the exception of the demobilization from World War II. What's particularly striking is that nearly half of that deficit reduction, 2.7% of GDP, happened in just this last year, in fiscal year 2013. And although deficit reduction is an important long-term policy goal, when you have fiscal consolidation that happens at that pace, it creates a real challenge for the overall economy. Fortunately, we've had a private sector that's led our economic recovery, so we've seen our growth rate roughly unchanged, despite the fact that federal spending subtracted from GDP in 10 out of the last 12 quarters. And more importantly, there's some good news here, which is that we've now gone through the most severe fiscal headwinds that we expect to go through. The deficit is going to continue to come down, but at a much more gradual pace. I don't expect we're going to see another 2.7 percentage point decline in the deficit in a single year. And that'll leave even more space for the private sector to drive the economy. The first fiscal fact was about the past and the recovery. The second was about the present and the deficit coming down really quickly. The third fiscal fact I wanted to talk about is about the future. And it's that we have, as everyone knows, a medium and long-run deficit challenge. But I think less widely appreciated is the fact that that challenge is actually more modest compared to what a lot of people feared even recently. For years, we've been warned about our long-run deficit problems, and for good reasons. The familiar points about the baby boomers retiring, about fertility rates declining, about the cost of healthcare system-wide in both the private sector and the public sector growing faster than GDP, all combine to create a genuine challenge. But in the last few years, something remarkable and not widely appreciated has happened in this regard. The projections for the medium and long-term budget outlook have improved considerably. Before describing this improvement, I want to just spend a moment talking about how economists like to, or at least ought to, measure our long-run fiscal imbalances. And it stems from what our basic goal is. Our basic goal is that we would like to see our national debt declining as a share of the economy. And if it's declining and ultimately stable as a share of the economy, that's how we know that our fiscal policy is sustainable. And that's how we know that we'll have our economy be able to focus its resources on investment and private sector growth, rather than being forced to undertake escalating borrowing from future generations and from abroad. If you look at the latest CBO forecast, the debt of the share of the economy is falling through 2018, and then it starts a gradual rise. So we certainly haven't solved the problem. But to calibrate the magnitude of that rise, you don't want to look at numbers that say, what would the debt and deficit be 75 years from now, which you sometimes, hear in some of the scaremongering, because anytime you have a small deficit and run it out 75 years, it's going to compound into a huge and scary number. A more useful yardstick that economists like to use to assess the long-run debt is something called the fiscal gap. And it asks how much you would need to raise taxes or cut spending today as a share of the economy in order to stabilize the debt over the long term, say a period of 75 years. And CBO's latest estimate of the fiscal gap is that it's 1.7% of GDP. So if you just raised taxes or cut spending or did some combination of the two that was equal to 1.7% of GDP, you would stabilize the debt over the next 75 years. To put that in context, as recently as a couple years ago, comparable estimates of the fiscal gap were 5 to 10% of GDP, which would be a massive adjustment. 1.7% of GDP is a lot more manageable. Well, what changed? One big item is healthcare. CBO estimates that the Affordable Care Act will reduce the deficit over the coming decade by about 0.5% of GDP. And in addition to the ongoing developments that have slowed the cost of healthcare in the health system, it will be even more than that in the future. In fact, you look at Medicare, and spending in 2020 is now projected to be 20% lower than what we thought it would be just a few years ago. Add all of that together, and that's taken about a point out of our fiscal gap. Another important thing is the Budget Control Act, which, not counting the sequester, is cutting discretionary spending to its lowest level as a share of the economy since the 1950s. And a third item is on the revenue side of the equation, where we took tax rates for high-income households and returned them to what they were in the 1990s, and did some other additional measures for high-income taxes that's also closing the long-run fiscal gap by about 0.4 percentage point. And then finally, you have revised economic and technical forecasts, things like lower interest rates. I want to stress that when you're talking about the budget over 10 years or 75 years, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. We've often had predictions and been badly wrong when things have turned out a lot better than we expected or a lot worse than we've expected. The last couple of years, the deficit's actually come in a lot better than we were expecting. One way to think about the uncertainty is Larry Summers did a calculation. He said if the economy were to grow just 0.2 of a percentage point faster per year, we'd erase that 75-year fiscal gap entirely and stabilize the debt as a share of the economy. It isn't clear, though, what role uncertainty should play in our fiscal policy. To some degree, you don't want to overreact to a problem you're uncertain about by making major changes that are difficult to reverse. But on the other hand, the uncertainty does call out the need for insurance against potential future economic needs, natural disasters, or other events. But regardless, the outlook looks a lot better than it used to. Those are my three facts, and I now want to talk about the judgment. And the judgment, I think, is almost the most important for motivating what the administration is trying to accomplish in fiscal policy. And the judgment is one that I think many, if not most, economists, business leaders, and experts from across the political spectrum would share. And it is that our biggest fiscal challenges are about the composition of spending and the composition of revenue. And to get into what I mean by that, the composition of spending is that we're doing too little to invest in infrastructure, to invest in education, to invest in research. And there's still more we can do to bring down the cost of healthcare. When it comes to the composition of revenue, the biggest issue is the way in which we collect our revenue. And in particular, especially when it comes to business taxation, a tax rate that's now the highest of any country in the world, but also a tax base that's among the narrowest of any countries in the world, so that we're not raising a lot of revenue, we're just doing it in a very inefficient manner. And so I think those three facts and that one judgment motivate what I think is most important in fiscal policy going forward, which is we need some more deficit reduction. We have a challenge there, but it's a manageable challenge. But the really important thing is to take the deficit reduction we've already done and build on it in a smarter way. And doing that in a smarter way involves doing more to continue to return the economy to its potential, more to expand that potential, and more to reduce inequality. The first part of doing it in a smarter way is the time path of deficit reduction. Some of the macroeconomic challenges that economies around the world face are really difficult. I wouldn't want to be advising some of the countries in Southern Europe because it's not 100% obvious the exact thing to do. Here in the United States, what we should be doing is incredibly obvious. And almost any economic textbook you would look at would tell you that we need to be doing less fiscal contraction up front and more deficit reduction over the medium and long term. And nearly a year ago, the president put forward a framework that does just that. It provides relief for the sequester and upfront jobs measures like investments in infrastructure, teacher jobs, and small business tax credits. And if you compare that framework to the sequester, it's really striking. It doesn't just have these upfront investments, but fast forward to 2021. The sequester is cutting the deficit by $109 billion in 2021. The president's balanced approach is more than double that at $224 billion. If you go to 2023, the sequester is ended, and it's basically barely cutting the deficit at all anymore, and the president's framework has now grown to $296 billion. As a result, it's a framework that would get the debt down as a share of GDP, and based on CBO's estimate, close 2/3 of that 75-year fiscal gap I was talking about before, and on OMB's estimate, which is the administration's estimate, would close the entire gap. Want to next talk briefly about the composition of government spending, which is the second element of that agenda. And I've referenced a lot of this already in the course of my remarks, but really wanted to underscore 2 points with regard to the composition of investment. One is there's some areas that clearly we need to do a lot more in. One of the big major proposals in the president's budget is preschool for all, ensuring that every state would have the ability to provide preschool for everyone. Another is infrastructure, where we've been going month to month, year to year in our investments in America's infrastructure. Given the returns to infrastructure, given the federal costs of borrowing, clearly that's something we should be doing more of. But investment isn't just about more. We have budget constraints, we have limited resources. I was talking about how we're on track to have discretionary spending, the lowest as a share of the economy since the 1950s. So we also need to care about how those resources are used. In education, the Race to the Top program was an example of leveraging a small amount of money into a large amount of policy changes that would have benefits for education beyond just the amount of money you were spending. And when it comes to infrastructure investment, we need to figure out how to leverage our federal dollars, how to use things like cost benefit to make sure we're spending those dollars better, and how to encourage private investment in the United States, because we're not going to have enough money to do everything that we need to do. The next area of fiscal policy is the composition of revenue. And in July, the president proposed that we focus on a grand bargain for jobs. At the center of this grand bargain is a combination of business tax reform and some of the investments I've just described. I think business tax reform is one of the areas within tax policy that's the most promising for growth, and the basic motivation for it is to have a tax code that's more neutral, that's not rewarding one type of investment over another, one form of business over another, or locating overseas over locating in the United States. I think there's also substantial scope on the individual side for simplification, for greater fairness, and for raising tax revenues without raising tax rates, but instead by cutting back on inefficient and wasteful tax expenditures. The next area of the budget I want to talk about is how it does and does not matter for inequality. And to put this in perspective, want to talk about a really striking statistic that researchers at Columbia University recently did. They took something called the Supplemental Poverty Measure, which was introduced under the leadership of Becky Blank when she was at the Department of Commerce, and it's a much more accurate measure of poverty in a lot of ways, including fully reflecting government policy. And what these researchers did was they took that measure and extrapolated it all the way back to the 1960s. And they looked at what the poverty rate would be if we ignored all of our government policies, and they looked at what the poverty rate was with our government policies. If you ignored tax credits for the poor, food stamps, unemployment insurance, Social Security, all the different elements of the social safety net, the poverty rate in 1967 was 32%. In 2011, it was 31%. It barely moved in 44 years. Now add in the EITC, add in refundable tax credits. Those were invented well after 1967 and have been expanded a lot since then. Add in food stamps, add in other programs, and you measure the poverty rate. And you'll see that it fell from 27% in 1967 to 16% in 2011. So we've actually cut our poverty rate by 40% in 44 years, and we cut it entirely because of fiscal policies. We've tried to build on that. We expanded refundable tax credits in the Recovery Act. We created the Affordable Care Act, which has broad benefits, but it includes some particularly progressive ones. And we've paid for those and paid for deficit reduction in part with returning tax rates on high-income households to what they were in the 1990s. And one striking thing you see, if you look at poverty in the aftermath of the Great Recession from 2007 through 2011, if you ignored government policies, the poverty rate rose 4%. If you take them into account, it only rose 0.3%. So we went through the worst recession since the Great Depression, and the poverty rate barely rose. And that's a testament both to the longstanding safety net and the ways we've been able to expand it. Going forward, there's certainly more scope for fiscal policy to continue to help middle-class families and those struggling to get into the middle class. That's why we're trying to do things like make permanent tax credits for education, defend nutrition assistance against large proposed cuts, and extend emergency unemployment insurance. But I think realistically, some of the biggest gains we're going to see in inequality and poverty in family incomes going forward aren't going to come from fiscal policy, but are going to come from what economists would call the rising pre-tax and transfer of income. And that comes from things like raising the minimum wage. And it's the decline in the minimum wage since 1967 that's one of the important reasons that poverty rate stayed stuck in the way I described. The last element of fiscal policy that I'll just briefly put on the table is common sense immigration reform. And I warned you that I was going to try to stuff almost everything under the heading of fiscal policy. Common sense immigration reform has a lot of motivations. It's motivated by attracting talented workers. It's motivated by reuniting families. It's motivated by strengthening America is a country of immigrants. It's motivated by improving our border security. But one of the many benefits it has is that it cuts the deficit by $160 billion over the next decade and $700 billion over the decade following. And that's by bringing more taxpayers in. So in conclusion, I've only had a chance to discuss the part of the agenda that I could remotely fit under the heading of fiscal policy. There's a lot more in what the president calls a better bargain for the middle class that includes jobs, healthcare, retirement, college, housing, and ladders to the middle class. There's a lot more beyond, energy production. There's a lot more like the slowdown in health costs, the increase in energy production, the reduction in the use of oil, improvements in technology, a whole range of things that would love to get into that matter for the economy. But I've tried to keep my focus, at least as narrowly as I could, on what you could construe as fiscal policy. And I think that will remain one of the really important things for getting the economy back to its potential, increasing its growth, and reducing inequality. And I think the good news here is, unlike a lot of economics, which is a dismal science, there's a lot of win-wins here, or win-win-wins. You can invest in infrastructure, create jobs today, and help the economy over the long run. You can reform your business tax code. It doesn't need to cost a dime, and you can make America more competitive. You can cut the amount of fiscal contraction in the short run and increase the amount of deficit reduction in the medium and long run. So I think there's a lot of relatively simple and basic economic policies in this area that are a huge opportunity. The biggest challenge is not figuring them out, but figuring out how to get them done in Washington the way it functions today, and working together with Congress to actually follow through on them. So with that, I am happy to take any questions you have, and I guess you're precluded from giving long speeches unless you wrote them out on the yellow cards and you all are reading the speeches. But
hi, Dr. Furman. Very done. I probably won't read long speeches verbatim, so just FYI. To start off our discussion and hopefully encourage more questions, keeping in mind that there are lots of economics students as well as practitioners and educators in the room, what would you say is the most important economic lesson the public needs to learn, both from the recent economic, financial, and fiscal crisis, keeping in mind, of course, that all elected officials are still members of the public?
I think the most important thing is that public policy can make a really big difference. And we actually have learned a lot and have improved and shouldn't despair. So 7.3% unemployment is too high an unemployment rate. Jobs that still haven't attained their pre-crisis peak is, we need a lot more jobs. But the economics profession has actually learned something in the last 70 years. I think part of why this recession was nowhere close to the Great Depression, where we had a 25% unemployment rate, is we had better fiscal policies, and we had better monetary policies, and we had better financial policies more broadly. And that's made a real difference. And there can be this defeatism on the one hand that the economy needs to go through some inevitable pain to cleanse itself, and this sort of a moral lecturing of that type. And on the other hand, a real despair of there's nothing you can do. And I think both of those attitudes are wrong. I think there really are things you can do to make a difference. That's the big picture macro. There's 100 other micro examples, and how to improve a training program, or make the patent system better, or do something about immigration. Oh.
You have to talk right into it.
Why don't you go ahead and ask another one, Catherine?
Well, all right. I'm spoiled for choice. But you talked a lot about the gains that were made to poverty through fiscal policy intervention, including tax credits and food stamps and things of that nature. But I guess what this question is trying to get at is, does that shift the burden from employers to provide better wages and better opportunities from their workers? Because now the government will pick up the tab that they choose not to. There's been a lot of reports about companies like Walmart and what percentage of their employees are actually receiving federal benefits. And then a follow-up to that would be, how important is the minimum wage in that discussion? And not just the minimum wage for all workers, but the minimum wage for disabled workers, the minimum wage for tipped workers, or even the minimum wage that's not paid to undocumented workers.
Mm-hmm. So in answer to your first question, I don't think you need to set up a debate between what an economist would call a pre-tax and transfer policy, like the minimum wage, and what an economist would call a post-tax and transfer policy, like the earned income tax credit. To talk about the earned income tax credit, and Carl Scholes could tell us a lot more about it. In economics, we tend to think the incidence of taxes falls on the worker. So the person that benefits from the earned income tax credit is the person you'd think that would benefit, which is the person getting the job. And I think the benefits go beyond just the amount of income. It goes to when people are choosing whether to participate in the labor force or not, having an extra incentive for that participation. I think the evidence influences that decision on the margin, and there's also a certain amount of evidence that it helps with mobility as well. But that doesn't let us off the hook on the minimum wage. At this point, the president's main proposals with regard to the earned income tax credit is to take the large gains we had over the last decades, his ambitious increase in the Recovery Act, which has now been extended through 2017, and to make that permanent. The bigger margin going forward in terms of reducing poverty would be in terms of raising the minimum wage. And to that end, it's quite striking that adjusted for inflation, the minimum wage in 2012 is the same as it was in 1950. So, in 2013, I mean. So in 63 years, you haven't seen the minimum wage rise adjusted for inflation. I think there's substantial evidence that you have scope to raise the minimum wage, a little bit above where it was when the economy had less than half, or I think less than a third, the productivity it has today, and be able to do that without significant adverse effects on employment. And in particular, we see the policies in combination. So we'd like a minimum wage that when you take your minimum wage, you take your tax credits, that will take a family working full-time that currently might be below the poverty line and lift them up above the poverty line.
Further on the minimum wage, could you elaborate a little bit on what you see as the evidence that employment would not fall if the minimum wage were raised?
Sure. And by the way, I realized I didn't mention the tip minimum wage, and that's important too.
And also the disabled worker minimum wage.
Yeah, so all of those important. And the tip minimum wage, just for people who don't know, the way it works is the minimum wage now is $7.25 an hour. If you work in a restaurant, the restaurant is obligated to pay you $7.25 an hour no matter what. But if it's been a slow night, you've gotten $3 an hour of tips. What that obligation means is that the waiter or waitress has to go to their employer and say, hey, I only got $3 of tips, so you have to take out of your own pocket $4.25 from me, or you'll be in violation of the law. You can guess how often something like that happens and how well that works for the waiter or waitress, pretty terribly. And that's why having a tipped minimum wage, which we haven't raised, I think, since 1993, is really important to protect those workers. In terms of the effect on employment, there's basically, in theory, two effects of a higher minimum wage. One effect is it's a higher cost for the business. You need to pay the worker more. The other effect is that you'll get more productivity from that worker. You'll attract workers, you'll motivate them more, you'll retain them, you'll have less turnover. And it's an empirical question, the relationship between these two. There have been a lot of studies. The ones that I think are generally considered the most persuasive are where you look at a minimum wage that increased in one area and didn't change in a neighboring area. And that was pioneered by Hardin Kruger in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. People have since done it to, I think, more than 1,000 paired counties across the country. And those studies have generally found a negligible impact on employment. And a recent literature review looked at 64 studies of the minimum wage. A few found large negative effects on employment. A few found medium-sized positive effects on employment. Most found something that was very close to zero. So I think you want to take into account what you're raising the minimum wage to, and the fact that we're talking about increases that are within the range of what we've seen in recent history, within the range of what we've seen in studies, makes you comfortable at that level that the benefit for wages is going to well outweigh any not large adverse impact on employment.
We'll continue on the topic of social programs and their effectiveness in bringing down the poverty rate. There are 26 states that are under one-party Republican rule in 2013, and new hurdles are being placed in front of these programs continually. Could you speak to the importance of that problem and other conflicts between federal and state policy?
Well, I mean, I think the most depressing example of a conflict you see right now is the number of states around the country that have the opportunity to cover poor families for free in Medicaid, paid entirely by the federal government, and have chosen not to take it up. I mean, that is the single lowest hanging, most obvious fruit of state policy that's trying to do right by its citizens, do right by its hospitals, by its doctors, by its economies. And not every state in the country has done that. More generally, I think federalism is important. I think you benefit from states as laboratories of democracy, and a lot of the innovations we've seen at the state level, you can learn from different states. States raise their minimum wage above the national. They add EITCs that we don't have. At the national level, they raise, in other cases, have chosen in the past to raise their Medicaid above what the federal government would require. So I think it cuts both ways, but certainly what we're trying to do at the federal level is create an incentive and ability for states to move up. So for example, I gave that example. Another one is the unemployment insurance systems. Those were created in the 1930s. In a lot of states, they were very antiquated in the way you counted who was qualified for unemployment insurance or not, and it made sense in a single male full-time worker in the 1930s, but not in a modern workplace. What we did in the Recovery Act was we had something called the Unemployment Insurance Modernization Act, where we gave states basically 100% funding if they wanted to change their laws. And I think most of the states in the country chose to revise and update their unemployment laws in order to get that money. So, we need to work together with states, learn from them, and encourage them.
We've just talked about the expansion of Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Could you elaborate on the mechanisms by which the Affordable Care Act is projected to reduce the deficit?
Sure. The Affordable Care Act, and I think it's important to take a step back of, for a decade, we had seen a lot of major pieces of legislation, none of them were ever paid for. And when it came to the Affordable Care Act, the president, didn't go out and say, I'm not going to pay for this. He didn't go out and say, I know the Congressional Budget Office scores it as costing money, but I think it's going to do so many cool things for our health system that I don't think it costs any money, therefore, I'm going to be okay with it. He said, let's take the Congressional Budget Office, they're the official referee, we'll take them as our test, and we'll make sure that it cuts the deficit, not just in this decade, but in decades to come. It did that in part by slowing the growth of Medicare. There were some areas where you had a lot of waste. For example, in Medicare, you can be covered by a private plan, or you can be covered by fee-for-service, traditional Medicare. We were paying private plans. I think it was about 15% more than we were paying fee-for-service. That didn't make sense, so we cut that back. There's also innovations you can do, like not paying a hospital if they, amputate the wrong limb. Hospital errors, hospital-acquired infections, readmissions, all of that, do a combination of carrots and sticks to improve the way you're doing reimbursement. That's what we did on the Medicare side, and then we also brought in some revenue, and the biggest revenue source we brought in was there's a Medicare tax right now. It applies to earned income, to your wages. We extended it for high-income households who made above $250,000 for a married couple. We extended that tax to unearned income, so you'd pay it on your capital gains, dividends, and interest as well. Take all of that together, and the Affordable Care Act was projected to reduce the deficit by more than $1 trillion in the second decade. A week ago on TV, I said that the Affordable Care Act was doing more to cut our medium and long-run deficit than the sequester. And in Washington, there's all these flurries of fact checkers, and they all sort of swarm around you, and they like to give you these things they call Pinocchios, and the worst thing you can get from a fact checker is 4 Pinocchios. Fact checker called me, and I think he was trying to decide between, was he going to give me 2 Pinocchios or 3 Pinocchios? And I sent him the Congressional Budget Office studies, and I got something that, not to be self-promotional, is exceedingly rare from the fact checkers, which is called a Geppetto, when they decide what you said was entirely true. So, I think that tells you something, that the Affordable Care Act, is doing more to cut the deficit than the sequester over the medium and long run.
Will the administration consider a carbon tax, and what would be the fiscal implications?
Yeah, that's not something the president's proposed or has any plans to propose. There's probably others here that could analyze the fiscal implications.
He did bring it up in his first State of the Union.
He did not bring up a carbon tax. He brought up cap and trade, which is a way to use a market-like mechanism to efficiently reduce the amount of carbon emissions, making sure whoever can do it in the cheapest way is the one that can reduce it. That plan was passed by the House and stalled in the Senate. What we're trying to do to make progress on that now is use the administrative authority we have. And we did that with the car rule, with light trucks, with heavy trucks, increasing fuel economy standards, which is going to be a large reduction in emissions and oil use. We've done it with new power plants, and we're going to extend that regulation of carbon emissions to existing power plants. Again, trying to do it in as flexible and market-oriented a way as we can. And that's going to be, I think when you look back at what this administration has accomplished in its 8 years, I think high up on the list will be what it did administratively to deal with our energy security and our climate.
We just talked about how fiscal policy takes time to go into effect. For example, the environmental policies of the Obama administration. How does the fact that there is a lag between deciding on what to do in terms of fiscal policy and its actual effects, how does that lag affect the advice you give to the president?
That is one of the traditional arguments against countercyclical fiscal policy, is the lag, which is that it takes you a while to figure out the economy's in recession. It takes you even longer to figure out how to pass whatever it is you pass. And by the time it goes into effect, you're doing a bunch of investment and the economy has already recovered. We've had a lot of challenges in the last 6 years. That problem hasn't been high up on the list. Some things we've moved really quickly. The Recovery Act was pretty amazing. We started putting that together on the Wednesday morning after the election ended. I was in campaign headquarters at 9 a.m. with 2 other people. One was on the economic team. The other one was there, I'm not quite sure why, but I kid you not, we brought him onto the economic team and he stayed on it for the next 2 years because he had the misfortune of being there that morning. And we passed the Recovery Act by February of 2009, so within a month of his taking office. And something like the Making Work Pay tax credit there went into effect by April 1st. So you had an incredibly short turnaround. So I think at a time like this, now too, we're at 7, we don't need something like the Recovery Act. We need more sustained efforts, like a sustained effort in infrastructure, sustained effort in business tax reform. But I'm not worried that the economy will have 100% recovered and growth will be 100% perfect by the time those go into effect. those types of lags are a little bit less of a concern now.
Dr. Furman, why should reducing inequality be a policy goal of the U.S. government?
Look, there's no question that that's a value statement, and different people may differ with that value statement. And I think inequality matters a lot in the context of the slower productivity growth I was talking about too. And the two combined produced what I talked about in terms of the poverty rate, what I talked about in terms of median family income. If you look at, and there's one very large developing country that's seen a large increase in inequality, but it's also seen a massive reduction in poverty as it's grown quickly. And you might have, I don't have a particular value judgment in that case, but you might have a different one. So I think what we worry about most with inequality is what it's done, at least what I worry about, in combination with the growth rate over the last several decades, what that's meant for poverty and family incomes. But I guess the other thing is that, I think also a less controversial statement is equality of opportunity. I think almost everyone in America believes in that. And I don't think you can have the type of inequality in resources I described before and actually have equality of opportunity. I think that's, you're kidding yourself if you think, one of the top 1% of the 1% has the same opportunity as the bottom 20%. Oh, sorry about that.
We've mentioned long-term economic health and growth. Today, the amount of people in America who are long-term unemployed is 4 times higher than it was in 2007. Do you see this as a structural change in America's economy or more cyclical?
That's a great question, because that's one of the biggest questions that we're grappling with in the job market right now. I compliment you with all the great questions. I assume you had like 40 terrible ones and you just pick out the good ones. So thank you. To date, it still feels a little bit more cyclical. If you look at things like the relationship between the unemployment rate and vacancies and some of the ways we try to assess the degree to which something is structural or cyclical, it still feels more cyclical. But I think we have to be very nervous that people who haven't found a job for a year, for 2 years, start losing some of their integration with the workforce, some of their ability to find jobs, some of their ability to be matched productively to those jobs. Part of the answer to long-term unemployment is the same as the answer to unemployment, which is anything you're doing that's returning the economy more quickly to its potential is going to bring down long-term unemployment. You don't need a special policy to do that. You just need stronger aggregate demand and lower unemployment, and then businesses are going to need to hire those people the way they did in the 1990s. But I think some things probably will require more special policies, and that could be anything from discouraging employers to discriminate against the long-term unemployed in their hiring to helping workers, transition into jobs and find those jobs and giving incentives to employers to hire them. And we've proposed some things in those regards, but it still remains a big challenge.
Should the U.S. devote more funding to economics research?
I think we should certainly be devoting more funding to research, and I'd have to check what we included in our budget for economics research, and whatever we included in our budget, I personally support strongly. But reminder to get that number up for next year.
Going on the idea of research driving the long-term health of the economy.
Is this like the most coordinated? Like, I have never done even like an interview with a one-on-one moderator that was as fluid as the two of you are in the back and forth. So,
my question is, what do you think the federal government can do to encourage companies to spend more on research and development?
One piece of low-hanging fruit there is the research and development tax credit. And the way the tax credit works right now is it's a subsidy for research. The tax credit is extended for 1 or 2 years at a time. It then goes away. No one's quite sure whether it's going to be there or not. And then retroactively, after you've already made all your research decisions, it gets extended again. That's not the best way to spend money. A much better way would be to take that tax credit, make it permanent, so you'd know it would be there and could count on it in making your decisions. Expand it somewhat, reform it to simplify it. So that's clearly one tool we have. I think another tool we have, though, is just what we can do in partnership between the government and private business. So when it comes to manufacturing, for example, we have proposed manufacturing institutes, and Becky was heavily involved in this when she was at the Department of Commerce. And what that does is it takes small amounts of federal money, it leverages up private money and university money in helping to seed clusters of research. And so we have one in Youngstown, Ohio, on 3D printing. We have an application process out for 3 more, and we'd love funding for many more of them across the country. So there's ways I think that we can be smart and help catalyze what the private sector is doing, bring people together, and get more research that way as well.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Since Luke's microphone wasn't working, I'll give him the last shot.
Okay, and speaking about, again, the long-term health of the economy, how serious of an issue do you see youth employment today?
Yeah, I think that's another, in the labor market, that's probably maybe our second biggest challenge. The story there is we've seen a decline in the participation rate for younger people, but we've seen a big increase in education for younger people. And so it's not an entirely one-sided story that education is going to have a lot of benefits, and that's going to be one of the silver linings of the experience we went through. And the United States has avoided the devastating youth unemployment problems you see, for example, in much of Europe. But all that being said, I think you do certainly want to look at it as an issue. You want to make sure that all of that education is useful, good, has a high rate of return, and as all of your education certainly is. But you want to make sure everyone else shares in that as well, and that the decline in the participation rate is fine if it represents 100% a choice, but we'd like to make sure it is a choice, whether you go to school or get a job, not just that the labor market, because of where it is influencing you in that way. So anyway, thank you so much. These were terrific questions, terrifically asked.